Good morning to all my friends and family, and welcome to this episode of Jim's 5am Club. Saturday morning down here at Barangaroo before everybody kicks off their Saturdays. And as we normally do, we're going to kick off the day with a book summary. And today's book summary is a little bit different to the ones that we normally do. It's a book entitled Maoism by Julia Lovell. A fascinating book looking at the political movement of Maoism. I haven't really understood this in the past, haven't really focused on it, but today, thanks to this book summary that I've come across, I'm going to go through a few of the key points to enable us to identify and understand the key elements of Maoism, and to, compare and contrast it to other political ideologies that we've grown up with, that we live with, and to understand, what the dangers are, or what the dangers have been identified from the past, and make sure that we don't go down that path ever again in our lives. So the author of this book kicks off with an interesting quote where she says that Mao's great talent, and when we say Mao we mean Mao Zedong, Mao's great talent laid in his ability to turn the Chinese people into slaves whilst making them feel like they were masters of their country. And he was a dictator, and all the world's dictators have studied Mao over the years. So it's interesting to kick off this book with that quote. And one of the great skills that political leaders have is their ability to manipulate their subjects, their people, by putting one class up against another, by building popularity, but doing so not to benefit the whole, but to, benefit themselves by maintaining control over the agenda and over the message being generated. So Mao Zedong was very, very good at bringing people on board and using that to express and grow and develop his form of communism. And the author here reminds us that not all communism models are the same, but the Mao Zedong, the Maoist form of communism, is a very, very toxic form, and one based on using violence and suppression of free speech as its main tool. And Mao was the initiator who propagated this most toxic and dangerous form of ideology, using public disinformation, control of media, and it got to the point where he created a cult-like following of subjects, of people who believed in his propaganda, believed in his message, and there are pockets which still believe it or not. So it's not something that was only there for the time being, but it's something which is still lingering in the world today. So this whole concept of public disinformation. So disinformation, just so you're aware, is different from misinformation. Misinformation is when people say things that they're not aware of, whether or not it's right or wrong, and just pass it on. And a lot of social media celebrities and influencers are the sorts of people who pass on disinformation because they've got no idea what is right, what is wrong. They just go with what is popular. But disinformation is where people know what they're saying is wrong and do it purposefully to manipulate others, to gain political advantage, and I guess to poison people's minds with information that is incorrect, that is wrong, but is useful for, as we said before, for gaining political advantage. So the first formal point to come from this book, from this author, is where we talk about how Mao Zedong kicked off and gained advantage and gained power. And he did it by appealing to a certain class of people. He did it by appealing to women and to peasants, people who didn't have the means back then, not saying today, but back then, to be able to understand that they were being used, they were being manipulated, because what he did was he talked in a way that made him popular. So he manipulated the people so that they could see him as being their saviour, and he turned his back on the rich and the middle class, and he played on people's insecurities and stereotypes, and he exploited their emotions and sparked a sense of revenge, us versus them. And he did what seemed like it was something which was isolated to that era. But he basically leveraged identity politics, the sort of stuff that we have happening today in the world. You know, the us versus them, blacks versus white, gay versus straight, pro-life versus women's rights. There are all these movements that separate and divide our communities, and we have never lived, I guess, in a more divided world than what we live in now. You just see with political parties, with elections, the outcomes are just so close to call. It's become a regular sort of occurrence, regardless of where the elections are happening throughout the world. So Mao Zedong was able to play on this early, back in the 60s and 70s with the Chinese people, and leverage popularity through manipulation, through disinformation, through propaganda, through separating people from each other, from classes from each other, and by destabilizing his country. So he leaned on the people who felt that they were disenfranchised. He talked about females' rights. He talked about, disenfranchised people's rights. But backstage, he was just a common garden variety dictator and a manipulator. But he used violence against his opponents and organised public executions and stuff like that, which appealed to the people who followed him, but also kept them in check, kept them scared. And Maoism attempted to spread further throughout the world, but the author here tells us that other leaders opposed it. Thank God they opposed it. And Mao organised for the publication of his Little Red Book, which is a compilation of popular quotes, and he tried to spread his form of communism to places afar with big populations like Russia and Indonesia, which led, incidentally, to unrest and the murder of up to 500,000 people, at least. The author then goes on to say that this style of communism can't exist without military backup. So it requires violence, it requires people to dob in others, requires police force. It's quite a scary sort of thought that these sorts of social experiments took off and took hold in a world where we've known about freedom of speech. We've known about people's choice forever and a day. But to think that there were millions, billions of people operating under these communist sort of rules is quite, disturbing. But what the author is telling us here is that China is in a process now of Maoizing, but the threat is still there. I guess my generation, my children's generation, and my grandchildren's generation will, I guess, live with the threat of China, but hoping that China de-Maoizes at a rapid rate, because I guess they are going down a path, an economic path of capitalism, but with a communist flavour. Don't know how that operates or how that's going to continue to operate. But I guess one of the good things that we can say about China is that over the past 20 or 30 years, it has lifted a massive 800 million people out of abject poverty, which in itself is significant for those populations. What it's done is it's provided the world, with 800 million, at least 800 million new consumers, people who can make a choice in terms of where they spend their money, where they travel to, how they live. I guess, once again, there is a system there that is overarching, and we'll wait and see what happens with Hong Kong, what happens with Taiwan. But just reading and understanding the history of the Maoist China is in itself enlightening as well. The other interesting thing here that we talk about is how Maoism tried to get its fingers, its presence into Africa via foreign aid. And we see that China does a lot of this, continues to do a lot of this, offer foreign aid to countries in the Pacific, and all of these elements of foreign aid are not done with the basis of being a great neighbour and being a country that wants to help, but it's all done with an intention to gain power, to influence. So we still need to be cautious of that. But this Maoist ideology tried to get into Africa via foreign aid, but the authors here tell us that what it did was it led to poverty and famine. But it did enable China to gain a UN seat. Mao Zedong died in 1976, but his influence is still alive. Mao's followers still keep his legacy alive, and interestingly enough, I wasn't quite aware of this, but there are still people who identify with Mao's ideology, and there's a 6-metre picture of Mao Zedong erected in Tiananmen Square in China. So even though China appeared to be going through a de-Maoification, there are elements and there are remnants, and there's the roots, deep-seated roots that are still there. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there. An interesting topic, something that I wasn't quite aware of in terms of China's history. It's one of those things that I haven't studied and I haven't focused on all that much. But there you go. The beauty of Jim's 5am Club is that we do book summaries, we learn through OPE, other people's experiences, and today we went on a walk and talk. We went on a journey and learned a little bit more about Maoism, the Chinese version of communism, which is quite oppressive, quite scary, and I guess in a particular way it's the opposite of democracy, because it's a dictator. It's a form of dictatorship where one person, one party basically dictate and tell people how to think, what to do, where to go, how to behave, which under certain circumstances, like the Chinese circumstances, it may have worked initially to get China to get to where it is today, because when it's all said and done, managing 1 billion people isn't easy. You're not going to manage 1 billion people through democracy to get them from abject poverty and to grow and develop an economy to become one of the greatest economies the world has ever seen through democracy. There needs to be some pain, some suffering, some tough decisions made along the way to make sure that people stay in line. But once you build up a head of steam, once you build up the framework and get the infrastructure in place and your economic presence and footprint across the globe, then it could be time to loosen the reins and to allow more freedom to people. But you know that you've done the hard yards along the way. Anyway, take care everybody. Wishing you a happy Saturday. It's a little bit cold, a little bit windy, a little bit overcast as you can see, but hopefully throughout the day cloud will blow away and we'll have a magnificent Saturday. Wishing you all the best. Take care and ciao for now. Bye.